Well, thank you, Scott, for having me. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Suchi Saria, who I was actually fortunate enough to be on a panel with a few weeks ago. And I can't begin to describe what an impressive computer scientist and individual she is. She did her PhD at Stanford with Daphne Koller, who's one of my favorite computer scientists in the world. And really, you see the same creativity and energy that Daphne brings to problems in Suchi's work. Her research has really pioneered the development of an entire generation of artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies to improve patient care. In sepsis, which is a life-threatening infection of the blood, her team's work really was the first demonstration of using machine learning to integrate a diversity of signals to predict sepsis and enable its early detection at Johns Hopkins. She followed up that research with her work in Parkinson's disease, which demonstrated the use again of kind of common everyday sensors to do disease severity tracking and diagnosis. Again, one of the first demonstrations of this in an actual patient population. Beyond her research, she's incredibly accomplished with her awards. She won a Rambis Fellowship. She's also won awards from the NSF Computing Innovation Fellowship, IEEE. She's one of MIT's 35 under 35 innovators in technology. And she's also won a very prestigious Sloan Fellowship for her work on her machine learning and the context of healthcare. She's certainly one of the emerging leaders in this exciting field of applying machine learning to the treatment of medical conditions, and I'm very excited to see what she's going to talk to us about this morning. Let's give her a hand.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. And very excited to see, I think in the last year and a half, more and more health systems. I think Sana has always been at the forefront. I'm not saying this because I'm here. My experience over the last 4, 5, 6 years has been that Sana has always been very forward-looking, very innovative, and sort of wanting to take on new ideas. And what's been really interesting for me is observing the last 2 years, nationally, internationally, but especially nationally, many health systems are making this area a mandate, where it's no longer a question of it being an esoteric discipline, but very much a part of a system's integral strategy into how are they going to think about it, what are the areas they're going to be productive with their data, and what are tools they can give to make both improve quality and reduce cost. So I felt like, 5 years ago I used to give this talk where I would talk about what are the possibilities, what can be done. And now I feel like you're seeing examples everywhere, all the way from radiology, pathology to, examples like sepsis and Parkinson's, in-home measuring disease at home, to home. So I think like talking about any 1 or 2 or 3 examples in detail, my thought would be, let's think about, given that there is possibility everywhere, where are we going? Where are we headed? Where do we stand? So I want to start with this paper. So this is a paper that talks about medicine and the computer, the promise and problems of change. Rapid advances in the information science, coupled with political commitment to broad extensions of healthcare, promise to bring about basic changes in the structure of medical practice. Computer science will probably exert some major effects by augmenting and, in some cases, largely replacing the intellectual function of the physicians. To accomplish, at the bottom, to accomplish this goal require new interactions among medicine, the information sciences, management sciences, development of new skills and attitudes, and policymakers in the healthcare system. Raise your hand. I'm going to do a little audience poll, and I want you to guess when was this paper written. So raise your hand if this paper was written in the last 5 years. So this is, since 2015. The lights are kind of bold and bright, so you're really gonna have to raise your hand tall. Okay, raise your hand if this paper was written between 2000 and 2015. Raise your hand if this paper was written between 1990 and 2000. Okay, raise your hand if I just made up this paper and it's a GIF. So this paper was written in 1970. Oh my goodness, 1970. I see some people in the audience smiling. So is that Dennis? Charney, no. Anyway, I see people in the audience smiling. So the question I want to ask is, we think we're so innovative, we're so cool, we have so many new ideas, and when I read this paper and it's from the 1970s, the question I want to ask is, what happened? That was, it seemed like they had it all right, they thought about all the right things, so what happened? What did we do? And is somebody just going to be giving a talk like 50 years from now asking the same questions about the amazing papers we're writing today? And so I love this field. I passionately care about this field. So this keeps me awake at night because I really think about, like, I want us to get it right. So the question is, like, it's useful to learn from history, like what happened and what are we doing? Are we doing things differently? Are we making the same mistakes? Here's another paper in the 1994, report card and computer-assisted diagnosis, great, C, blammo. So the question I want to think about in this talk is, like, what can we learn from like 70 years of work, 50 years of work in this space? So the first thing to talk about is, like, basically, is anything different now? So what's different? So the systems back then, systems back then were basically primarily rule-based systems. So, like, has anything changed? So one big shift that's happened is a shift in the kinds of systems we build now. So, almost all the systems up until the 1990s, up to 2000, I would say in late 1990s, early 2000s, were all systems of the kind where, expert programmers were sitting there collaborating with expert physicians, thinking through everything they were doing practically and then codifying it in a programmatic way. So they were literally just trying to automate the exact piece of logic that the provider would be using. And then the big shift that happened in the last decade is sort of, it's not that machine learning is new, machine learning has been applied, but like a big shift, and AI has been around as a field since the 60s, but sort of the emergence of learning from data as a mainstream in which we build smart systems. So the shift to machine learning has been a pretty big shift, and sort of in an intuitive sense, before we used to have these inputs and we'd write rules that would produce the outputs. And machine learning sort of flipped, and this is one type of machine learning, flipped the nature of work a little bit, where you have input, and it tells you what your output should look like, and it can learn rules. And the benefit of this is you can sort of, and our ability to do this from more and more complex data has increased dramatically. So the ability to take data where it would be very hard for a human to sit down and come up with the exact set of rules, like in speech, to be able to translate that into what the rules ought to be. And before I actually talk about sort of, you can see why this has parallels in medicine, right? Because when all we're doing is simply taking what the providers know and codifying it in programmatic speak, what I found from experience from deploying systems is, practically speaking, they don't see a whole lot of value in that. And the reason is because a fraction of the times, the system is actually right because you're exactly automating what the provider would have done in that situation. In that scenario, they're like, I already know that. I don't need to be told. I already know that. Get out of here. The other fraction of the time, what happens is it says something, this is the rule, you're disagreeing or you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. Very often, those are exactly the situations where our rules are too brittle. Often in most diseases, patients are quite different to, like, maybe they're 30, 40, 50, depending on the type of disease, the notion of sort of the majority, but it's a very heavy-tailed type of discipline, and that heavy tail is very hard to capture from, experts sitting there and trying to codify all the exceptions. And so because they're bad at codifying the exceptions, it's extremely hard to build systems using that sort of logic-based interface, that memory-driven logic-based interface in order to write things that can derive value. And if a large number of times when I'm being reminded that I'm steering away from my, quote, pathway, it's because I intended to, because my rule systems were broken to begin with, essentially that sort of leads to this idea of, like, this is not that interesting or valuable, and so they sort of take away from it. And so let's talk about, like, in the last 10 years, kind of progress. So in sort of this notion of our ability to learn from more and more complex data, you know, this is sort of a little timeline, 1961, you know, the first set of, let me give you a sense of like us practicing speech recognition as sort of a way to get like a lens into how progress has been made. So 61, we could sort of recognize 16 words or so in very, very controlled environments, very carefully curated systems. You can see there's almost like 40 years or 50 years of progress packed in half a screen, where we went from 16 words to being able to recognize speech in limited controlled environments with a limited vocabulary, but still quite a bit. And then from 2001, as you go down, you can start seeing these systems go into being able to recognize using, you know, speech, like human speech in the wild with Siri and Google Now and Cortana. And essentially, if you keep going, I'm going to keep going down. And now you can see the timeline is expanding because progress is happening so fast. And most recently, you know, sort of this is the zoo of applications now that utilize speech in very, very niche areas that are very targeted at like tackling the area really well. So this is sort of like how, you know, you can sort of see this kind of progress has been something like this, right? Like it's basically grown a lot in recent years. So the second shift is sort of this notion of, I said, shift from codes to learning. The second is this idea, which I think is much more underappreciated, but I think is very important for medicine, is this notion of the diversity of ways in which we can learn has grown dramatically in the last decade. So classically, what most people talk about is this notion of supervised learning, which is you have an image of a cat, you have an image of a dog, you give me the images, and you can tell me is it a cat or a dog. And that's effectively what majority of like press releases are about in other areas. Now in medicine, the problem is we don't have very good gold standards. So when we start getting really, really excited about overfitting and overtuning to a terrible gold standard, what you produce is garbage in, garbage out. But the thing that is pretty cool is that that's not the only means by which we can learn. We've built, I think, one of the bigger, most exciting opportunities to combine a diversity of ways in which we can learn. And so here are sort of some examples like semi-supervised reinforcement. I mean, these words, you know, over time they've evolved, but effectively my point is just like humans learn from different forms of supervision, it's not just a cat or a dog, we learn from experimenting. We learn from like doing adjustments for confounding by observational data. We learn from weak cues where we do triangulation to figure out what's going on. We learn from like asking questions. So I'll give you an example of how we thought about this in the context of an application. So this is work that was done over 5.5, 6 years. It took us a while to figure this out. When Apple first came up with ResearchKit, they were looking, I know one of it was from here in asthma at Sinai, I believe. The other area that they launched was Parkinsons, and that was all sort of work based off of this, this effort. And so the idea here was that Parkinson's, the treatment of Parkinson's today is the same as the treatment of what diabetes was like over 100 years ago, which is you have this enormous amount of variability over the course of a day in terms of symptoms and across days, and patients evolve very differently over time. And the challenge is you have no way to actually measure this variability in a granular way. And so imagine if you were trying to treat diabetes where all you had access to was one measurement of glucose once every 4 months, when you know there's so much variability over the course of a day and across days, and you were trying to actually treat this, you're trying to personalize treatment, it would be a disaster. But the challenge is that is exactly what this looks like today. So here, or at least 6 years ago it used to look like, as I understood it. So I think Ray is a friend of Mount Sinai, Ray Dorsey. He's a fantastic physician. We met at Hopkins when I first moved there, and we started asking this question: since it's a motor-related disease, couldn't we try to like take advantage of sensors, off-the-shelf sensors on a, you know, it could be home-based, it could be phone-based. We just sort of started with the phone because everybody has it. It doesn't require investments in hardware. A lot of the sensors actually, there are a fair number of very meaningful sensors you can leverage. And so our question was, could we measure all these different, both, so there were two ideas here. One is, can we measure passively a whole bunch of stuff and infer quantities of interest? The second question was, what if we designed this notion of, quote, active tests, like things that did, real-time interrupts, maybe a few times a day, and these active tests would be very quick tests. We're asking them to do very specific things that are very intuitive, very easy to do. So they, speak on the phone, they do a little, walk, so we get to measure what their gait looks like, how rigid they are, how flexible they are, how quick they are to respond. So very quick 2.5-minute test. And then the question was, could we combine these data from their home to start to think about symptom variability? And a large number of mobile studies suffer from the following challenge, which is you can collect all the wonderful data you want at home, because consumers now love wearables. The challenge is you can collect all the mobile data at home, but it's, for the most part, bits and bytes. It has really no clinical meaning. So you can see all the jitter, and you can see this gobbledygook of jitter. And the question then to us was like, okay, we think there's signal here. We don't know exactly and precisely what the signal is, but we know there are enough, quote, weak cues here that we think it might be possible, but there isn't a notion of a gold standard. So naturally, the thing you'd want to do is to start going and measuring some notion of a gold standard, which would be trying to measure UPDRS, which is an instrument neurologists use at home. But one, neurologists are very expensive. Two, it's not a reliable instrument. Three, it's not super easy to conduct it at home to get millions of dog and cat equivalent examples. So what we did is we designed this sort of a weak supervision-based method that allows you to somehow triangulate weak cues you know about a patient that in order to bootstrap into what would look like a gold standard. So I won't have the time to go into a deep technical talk as to what that is, but there will be pointers in the slides so this paper gives a pointer to the technical piece of it. But the cool piece was we basically could take advantage of these very messy data, use weak supervision, where the weak supervisory signal was very easy to acquire and could be done very cheaply, to bootstrap into what would be a single score that would fluctuate just like a glucose measure. And over the course of a day, we could get multiple measurements. So this is the first time ever a patient has been measured at home from a period of 7 months. And we have numerous such records where as each time they're taking these active tests, you get a little dot on this chart. And what it's doing for you is kind of showing you this version of, one, see the degree of variability. So if you just saw like one measurement over the course of 6 to 7 months, you'd have a hard time knowing what was going on. But more importantly, when you chart this over an extended period of time, you can see that this patient is actually pretty stable. So in other words, as you start to think about things like trials or using an endpoint on whether this drug is working or not, or is my treatment working or not, is this person deteriorating or not, these kinds of very precise endpoints are very important. And what this is saying is basically our old ways of using UPDRS is completely a terrible idea. So here in this case, we did a couple of things. One, we took this patient population, constructed such a score, and then we triangulated in a variety of ways because there wasn't a clear gold standard. So we triangulated it by prospectively recruiting patients. Now it was easier to do, where we basically computed this score and we computed UPDRS at the same time and did correlations with known instruments to show that these correlated very highly when conducted. Second, it had construct validity in the form that in this case, this patient is known to be responsive to drug, and you can kind of see that the score before they took the medication versus after, the score often improves, means this patient is drug responsive. And that's interesting because maybe you can use an approach like this to start seeing patients on whom the drug works or doesn't work. And then here's the example from a trial recruitment standpoint or endpoint, where, again, the score on top is like, the yellow score is basically, you can see, is relatively flat versus there were 3 measurements of UPDRS taken, and you can see, depending on the time of day it was taken, it would give you a totally different picture. So this patient might look like, in the first thing, oh, they're getting better, but then you see them again based on UPDRS, you may think they're doing really badly, when in reality, that's just normal fluctuation par for the course. And then here's another example of the same, the colors are different because it's a different graduate student who generated it. But the techniques are the same, which is here in this case, we're basically seeing that over time this person's getting worse. So you can sort of slowly chart to see this, the symptom getting worse over time. Another example, I'm actually going to skip through this. So another example is like sepsis goal. Again, we don't have good gold standards. To do it well is really hard. A lot of systems have now attempted to use coded data to try to learn systems for sepsis. And effectively, here what we showed is if there's a way you could bootstrap from weak signals in order to be able to build a system for early recognition. I'm actually going to skip this example. You can actually recognize sepsis very early, and over the last few years, as we've built and deployed these systems and physicians have been using it, it's been fascinating to see what we've learned, which I'll come back to in a little bit later in the talk. So this is my second point, which is this notion of the diversity in ways in which we will learn will be extremely powerful for medicine, if done correctly. But the if done correctly is actually a very big if, because as we've now seen in the literature, people are so excited to, you download TensorFlow, you run some study, you produce an AUC, you write a paper. It's this magical superpower people have produced to write papers now. And medical journals are getting inundated with half-baked papers where somebody downloaded a tool, run something, produce an AUC, write a paper. And so what that means is I feel what I'm seeing is 9 out of 10 papers that people are writing on this is very dubious. Where if you go in and you kind of look at, is it carefully validated? And maybe I'm not being, maybe I'm being too generous. Maybe it's more like the number's worse. Who knows? But effectively, what I'm getting at is I think it's really, if we don't want to be in this situation where we're in the 1970s, except fast forward to now, it's really important for us to think super hard about, like, we have these new capabilities, but how can we be practicing responsibly? So a big challenge area I see is like sort of how people think about validation. How carefully are they measuring? And sort of the euphoria around wanting to experiment and deploy sometimes kind of counters with, the question is kind of what's the cost? And a big challenge I see is that if we don't get it right, we're going to burn our physicians, and that's going to be terrible. Like, we don't want sort of a 10-year winter. This is actually, I think, work out of Sinai, where basically an example of a, naive, like they showed that if you just take a system, you naively apply it to your data, like these systems are very rich and powerful. They can really fit to your data. But also means that if you just naively apply these systems to data, so here in this case, it was chest x-rays looking for diagnosis of pneumonia, what they found was that it was really good in like 2 of these hospitals. When you took it to the 3rd, performance deteriorated. And the reason performance deteriorated is because it was taking advantage of features in this kind of image that you shouldn't have relied on to begin with. Sort of some notion of like what in machine learning is called this notion of data set shift. Like there was basically, when you go from place A to place B to place C, there's a shift in the distribution that happens in your data. And if you deploy systems that are not robust, or you don't understand the concept of shift, and you don't test robustness to shifts, you'll end up with systems that have odd idiosyncratic behavior. Here's another example where over time, so this is something we encountered in sepsis, which is over time, as CMS made sepsis reporting a requirement, people's practice policies changes, where they started requiring, physicians were preemptively ordering lactates all over the place. So before, the order of a lactate was very predictive. Now, the order of a lactate, so if you were using the same system and the underlying processes were changing, and the way you built your method is that it was one of those sort of naive applications to data where you weren't checking or building methods that are robust to healthcare process evolution, you would end up in a state where you basically go from essentially systems that, so in this example, like it behaved perfectly in environment A, but as policy started shifting, it started misbehaving in odd ways where it was alerting all over the place. So there's an emerging science around, one, like what are ways in which we can build these systems to be robust and create ways to audit these kinds of systems in order to be able to make it trustworthy. I think this is there's so much neat stuff that exists, and there's real opportunity to implement these ideas within practical environments, and something we all ought to be doing as we're taking so net my takeaways are, I think there's a lot more new capability, but at the same time it's really important we be thorough, careful, cautious, and partner with deeply knowledgeable people, because with power comes responsibility. And so here in this case, invest in process and infrastructure for quality, reliability, understand and measure what is and isn't working. And then final point, which I won't get to talk a lot about today, that we've learned a lot about in the last few years, is like algorithms are very overrated, behavior change is key. So you can sort of have the most swimmingly wonderful algorithm, but if you don't understand how it interacts with the environment and sort of how it's going to lead to behavior change, in the sense that, who are you showing, what are they seeing, why do they care to see it, why do they care to do the thing they need to do, how are they going to do it, are you making their lives easier, harder, what are you changing, what metrics are you improving? Those are all really key pieces that I think are probably assuming you can build something correct, are just as important, if not more important, in actually getting the outcome changes you want. We've put together sort of a tutorial as a high-level starting point for people who are curious to see, what are sort of coming at it from a reliability perspective in order to scale infrastructure, what are sort of key areas. And there's literature growing in this field very fast. So this was a year ago, and it already feels a little old, and hopefully I'll find some time to update it. But this is sort of the final slide. I think healthcare and medicine are going through a massive transformation. Past inventions are focused on drugs and devices. I think software will drive the next generation of inventions. To do it well, we need people who are very deep in tech and very deep in medicine. And it's going to involve deeply understanding a fair number of pretty hairy areas, all the way from non-experimental data, machine learning, and clinical medicine. Thank you. Should I be taking questions? Okay. I won't be here for the panel. I have to head out. I'll take a few questions. 2 questions?
Yeah. 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So you talked about using apps to collect data, but once you have an app and you have this channel, you can also go the other way. Have you been thinking about doing interventions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we now, on the Parkinsons work, have sort of a NIH-funded center that is exploring that. Absolutely. So on the the inpatient side, where I described the work in sepsis, a couple other areas, cardiology, we're working in 4 or 5 different service lines. We've developed ways to really deeply think about using this to drive the intervention, to then measure whether they did what they were supposed to do, the outcome, and understand when things are and aren't working, and revise. In the outpatient setting, with patients, we haven't done that, in part because it's a lot more hairy, because if you're driving care change, we need to be really sure that we've done a lot of the robustness checks, because it's a much more uncontrolled environment in which they operate. So we have to fully trust every piece of data that's coming in. So we haven't done outpatient. When I say outpatient, I mean unassisted, at-home interventions yet. But I mean, I think it's a good idea. Certainly there are lots of companies out there that are attempting to do it.
Thanks.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a PA in neurology and have been for 17 years. My question, part of it is cynicism, in the sense that as a clinician, I can see insurance companies wanting this kind of data, and if you can't show certain measures, they won't want to allow you to modify medication. And so thinking of that, and thinking of how Parkinson's also has a lot of non-motor symptoms,
Yeah.
how do you imagine that would be captured? Would you just do it with some kind of questionnaires that would then be required, or how would you capture the need to modify medication because of the non-motor symptoms?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think so we've been at this for 7 years easily, and we're nowhere near wanting to, we're nowhere near sort of, so the overarching principle here is whatever you introduce, you want to fully understand the consequences of what is being introduced. So for example here, so while I spoke about motor symptoms, there's actually a lot of non-motor symptom related ideas here that I didn't speak. So we do think about sociability. Like, are they moving a lot? Are they leaving the home? Are they alone? Are they talking on the phone? So we have some sort of like cognitive sociability related measures like loneliness, depression, sleeping, how much are they sleeping. So we do have some of those kinds of measures, but let's assume whatever we did, we were still like incomplete because there are other things that matter that this doesn't have. And in order to practice responsibly with these kinds of devices, you basically have, it's like a drug label, right? You need to understand when is it applicable, what are its limitations, what do you need to do to make sure that you're using it correctly. So in your example, you'd want to basically say it's very good at collecting these types of data and accounting for this type of thing. It's really not good at that. If we were going to do a trial in order to show that this is effective in making any kind of recommendation, you'd have to do sort of a system that is A plus B, where a physician might capture symptoms that the system isn't very good at, and then the two together are being used to make modifications. But I do think we shouldn't get anxious about data capture, because at the end of the day, I think in every other field, you can't get better if you don't know what is and isn't working. And the problem in medicine is we've just been really, really good at saying yes. We're very good at saying yes to a lot of incremental things. We keep sort of like, it's a good idea, go ahead. Good idea, go ahead. And then we keep doing this, and it becomes more and more and more and more and more complicated. And the challenge is like, we need to figure out ways in which we remove things that don't work, add things that work, make things more precise. And we as a system can't become effective or efficient if we don't have a way of precisely understanding what is and isn't working.
I do see there would be a great benefit, because I know as a clinician, often you'll have a patient who wants their carbidopa, levodopa increased because they don't feel good. And so it's challenging when you're a clinician, because primarily that is going to help with their motor symptoms, and yet they want you to increase the medicine that's not going to help with what their real complaint is. So having something like that you could look at, you would be able to see as a clinician, increasing this medicine is not going to help. It's really these non-motor symptoms. I can see it would be tremendously helpful.